I'm going to start off just getting you with some sort of general thoughts around resilience. So you've all, addressed that topic. And you raised it, I think, Mike, this idea of how do you get people to act in advance of something, particularly, and that's something you're obviously all grappling with, but have you thought or have you found anything particularly that works, particularly in your own experience with Wellington, about how, because this does seem to be a big issue for New Zealand, how you get people to think and prepare before the event itself?
Yeah, I think there's three things. I think, first of all, in investing in resilience, you need to improve people's day-to-day lives. For us in Wellington, in any city, it's easy to sell something if it's going to save people 5 minutes commuting on the road. Mm-hmm. But if you ask them to spend $1 billion on a road for resilience purposes, it just doesn't compute that word resilience again. So if we can get co-benefits of improving people's day-to-day lives while investing in resilience, that's a key. The second one is convincing people with by storytelling. Mm-hmm. And particularly when it comes to sea level rise. So a couple of councils around New Zealand have tried to deal with sea level rise by going straight to a district plan, making a plan change. And in both cases, publicly, Kapiti Coast and Christchurch City, both cases it's not worked. So I think we need to learn from that. I think we need to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes again, and that we need to take our time with something like sea level rise. We've got a bit of time on our sides, 10, 20 years before we have to panic, if we ever need to panic. So let's use that time to tell a story, get people understanding the imperative of why we need to change, and use that as the basis for convincing people that we need to invest in the future. And the final one is targets of opportunity. So when stuff happens, Judith Rodin says, never let a good crisis go to waste. So we had this shake last year. In Wellington, nobody died, but we scared the pants off everybody. So that's a massive opportunity for us to convince people that now is the time to act. So yeah, those are the three key things for me in terms of getting people to act when actually there isn't a crisis that's happening right now.
So just on that point, Elizabeth, a bit embarrassing that some of those buildings that actually didn't fare particularly well in Wellington were government buildings. So what does that say about the quality of the thought about risk mitigation in terms of the construction process?
Yeah, I'm not expert in that area to be, so I'm going to duck on that. But it is, it raises a lot of questions, and I think that's why I think it's so important that as well as the work on preparedness and making sure that we have the building codes and so on, there's a whole lot of work to be done around the prevention sphere about the decisions that are made. Really tough when you've already built your city, but in terms of new developments, a building on is what is essentially unstable soils or areas where you try to contain the river, but I saw the review from Sir Michael Cullen on the what happened with Edgecombe, and he's got a really good phrase in there where he says, you've got to let the river live, you've got to give the river room to live. And coming from a farming district where, we had floods every season, these are the sorts of things that have to be, these are the development decisions we have to make in Wellington City and where you put the high rises. And if you have to build there, think about what you're putting inside those high rises, what types of facilities, critically important.
Erica, I think you referred to in your presentation, I think it was a resilience dividend that you talked about?
Yeah, I talked about it.
In that one, yes. So how much of that is being considered within the New Zealand environment at the moment, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think the resilience dividend pays off even in the absence of a crisis. So if you looked, for example, at those 13 indicators that I had, and you picked up any good management book, they'd say that's all about just having a good business, having good leadership, good staff engagement, etc. So as Mike mentioned, it's all about finding those co-benefits. It's finding, we've only got a limited amount of funding that we can invest in building resilience. So it's going to be a really hard case to make to build it for the thing that's only going to have a payoff in a 1 in 500 year event. But if we can actually get the day-to-day benefits from it, then it's going to be a much easier case to sell. And we've just got to be proactive. There's never going to be enough money. There's always going to be legacy risk in buildings that we wish were of a better standard, but we've just got to make choices and just be really conscious that we're always moving towards resilience. I don't think we're ever going to achieve it. It's a goal, and we've just got to be strategic about where we put that funding.
Mike, you wanted to comment about the building issue.
Oh, yeah. The big buildings that failed in Wellington weren't actually government buildings. So Defence House wasn't owned by the government. Stats House isn't owned by the government. They're owned by private or Quengos. And so when we make decisions to do things like outsource ownership of buildings, then we do that on a commercial basis. And when you're making a decision on a commercial basis, as I mentioned before, a 1 in 500-year event doesn't really come into an asset with a life of 50 to 100 years. So, but I do think, reflecting on what happened in Wellington, of the top 7 or 8 organisations you'd want to stay in their buildings in a big disaster, I think we lost 6 of them. So the Defence Force, the Regional Council, the City Council, Centreport, the Electricity Company and the Water Company were all out of their building and all couldn't operate properly. In fact, they probably are the top 6 that you want to kind of keep functioning. So
you probably also want the IRD to keep functioning as well too. Because sad though it is, but we do need a revenue stream.
Yeah, at least the police and the hospital are okay.
Right.
But we've got some serious thinking to do there. A bunch of private people are thinking about this in Wellington at the moment, about resilience and how we might shape the future of our city. So we're really pleased that the private sector is starting to lead the thinking on this, because the council can't go it alone.
There's an interesting experience in Japan in the early 1980s after a major earthquake there, where a number of the businesses that owned high-rise buildings turned they brought in much stricter building code and controls, and a number of businesses were able to turn that into a competitive advantage factor, because they found that their commercial tenancies were full, those that have made the adjustment, and of course those that hadn't, the tenants, when they have a choice, vote with their feet.
Okay, some questions from the feed. For you, Erica, does resilient organisations work with rating agencies? If yes, what do they bring?
Yeah, so there are benchmarking tools for going out, and obviously that involves more than just surveying one person, because chief executives always think their organisation is high performing. Generally, but there are benchmarking tools where you can go out and actually question, all of your staff to get a really rich picture in terms of what those cultural things are that are going on within your organisation. And there have been certain rating agents, organisations that work with rating agencies, particularly from a sustainability and a climate change perspective, have been exploring using resilience metrics. So it hasn't come to fruition yet, but I think watch this space as the knowledge becomes more mature. If I was an investor, it's the sort of thing that I would be wanting a board to be reporting on in their annual report or whatever.
So on that point, Mike, question for you. How is the Wellington Council balancing the need for greater building resilience with the inevitable costs and financial constraints on owners and landlords?
I don't think that's a fair question, because the council can only regulate a certain band of Wellington's building stock, and as the current regulation settings are, is if a building is 34% or lower of code, then we have regulatory power to do something about it. I'm really pleased in Wellington that actually, again, the market's leading on this stuff. Three new buildings in Wellington, 2 under construction, one in planning stage. One is the PwC building on the waterfront, number 20 Custom House Quay, and the one that Sir Robert Jones announced a couple of months ago, his wooden high-rise building. These are the future of building stock in Wellington. Nothing to do with our regulation at all. It's the market that's driving it, and we're really pleased about that. That's the way of the future. From a regulatory point of view, we'll keep encouraging that and working with developers to make sure we've got the city that we aspire to. But in terms of regulation, we can only ever deal with the worst of the worst, and we will continue to do that. But we'll continue to encourage the bar to be raised all the time. But it needs private investment to do that. We can't do it alone.
Elizabeth, in the event of a natural disaster, i.e. an eruption in Auckland, how do you plan for the breakdown of social structure emergency services as people focus on their own and their own family survival?
Yeah. Again, the preparedness recovery is not the area that I worked in, but one of the things I did, the first overseas mission in my job at UNISDR was actually to go to Christchurch and talk to people who had to tackle just that issue. And I don't come from there, people like Erica and that will know this firsthand, but what really struck me was the
And a number of the people I met with really emphasised the importance of pre-existing social networks. And another point was made that you can have all the wonderful strategic plans in the world, but if you don't have people who are prepared to step up and assume leadership, it's not going to work. And there were very, very interesting stories of resilience, I would say, where because of something that had been happening in a completely different sphere beforehand, when the earthquakes happened, these same groups were able to offer something very helpful and proactive back to their local communities, whether it was the iwi running the feeding station, food station. I spoke to a number of emergency managers who talked about the importance of this. It's too late after the earthquake figuring out who do I call. You have to have those networks established in advance. So there's a whole range of stuff that has to be done to make us each more resilient and more prepared. But often it's the really simple messages that I thought were the most profound.
Erica?
I don't think that the social fabric actually breaks terribly easy. I think in a crisis, the community naturally comes together, and it speaks to what Nigel Latter was talking about, that there is altruism out there, and we saw it following Christchurch. Communities pulled together, many of them better than they would do in day-to-day times. And we can probably expect that to happen. There will be certain kinds of crises where suddenly that challenges, people like, so for example, in a pandemic where actually coming together might put them at greater risk. But my expectation, and we've seen it in many places around the world, even when there have been infections, is actually people put themselves at risk for their community. So I think we can actually expect that, and we should build off that. That's a key strength we can leverage.
Question for you, Liz. It seems like government needs to take the lead here in bringing multiple stakeholders together. What typically unwinds such efforts, or what must we avoid?
I think the reason why Tim asked me to put the focus on multiple stakeholders is that you sort of know intuitively what needs to happen, but when you actually try to do it and you've got all these different competing interests in the room, it's incredibly hard. So I think that if you don't have something that can unify and I know it's jargon, but get people on the same page, then the exercise can be overtaken by the individual turf wars and mandates, and it can unwind very, very quickly. My experience, overseas where we had to do this work is it's not just an academic exercise talking about having shared objectives and agreeing some core principles and having a unifying policy framework. That stuff really does work. And when I had these 25 UN agencies all working in the area of disaster risk, but essentially also competing a bit, the only way we were able to get that sorted was by working in a forum, coming together and actually working through a very sort of robust and systematic approach to develop the plan of action. And the plan of action, we had to reconcile what our goals were. Great debates over the meaning of resilience, of course. Disaster risk reduction, less so. Then we had to say, okay, what will we prioritise? And of course we had the development agencies and the humanitarian agencies, and they see the world differently. And then we had the politics of conflict, because we're talking about, I'm talking about natural hazards, but of course the elephant in the room is disasters from human conflict. But we were able to do it by actually agreeing a set of targets, and then we divvied up the action. So you still get tensions where you get these overlaps, and frankly, you just have to paper over those. And then if you have enough work being done around those unifying tools, like policy and objectives and strategy, and really good leadership from the top, then you've got enough momentum that you can make it work.
Quite, Mike, a question for you. It's a good one too. Some of the points raised actually require people to change their lifestyles. What's the strategy devised by the government to sell this idea?
philosophical question, right? Can governments change people's lifestyles, or do governments reflect the way that we live? And I'd argue, actually, the government is a reflection of the way that we like to live. That's why we have elections, and that's why parties win elections. So, having said that, governments do have a role to provide leadership and to reflect back, and sometimes challenge the way that we currently live. Now, for Wellington, it's actually quite easy because we can't expand and sprawl Wellington. It's forcing us to look closely at how we're going to live stacked on top of each other and ask hard questions about cars and that kind of stuff. And our job as local government can certainly help design, can certainly help build infrastructure to allow that to happen. But I'm not sure that it's just a government role. I think it's all of our role. But there are things we can do. One of my favourite projects in that resilience strategy is around electric vehicles. So we have this damn love affair with cars and real estate in New Zealand. And Wellington already, not compared to Auckland, but Wellington already has problems with congestion. And if we grow the way that we think we're going to grow, we can't just keep adding more and more cars in, because we just can't. You can see that it just won't work unless we double the number of roads, and there's just not the space to do it. We can't even get a damn cycleway in Wellington without causing civil unrest. So I think the key is to watch emerging technologies when they become popular, things like EVs. Our job is to make sure that we're providing public charging stations, maybe lobbying government about tax breaks for people that are driving EVs, because after all, an EV, if you plug it in, it will be using electricity from New Zealand, of which I think 80% is renewable. So it's a double whammy. You're getting rid of burning fossil fuels, and you've got a bunch of cars that are basically mobile batteries, so when we have something bad go wrong, we've got these mobile battery packs around the city. And we're really keen to look at that for buses and for rubbish trucks and that kind of stuff as well. We think we're on a real winner there. So our job is to promote, is to cajole, is to encourage through our contracts, and to make sure the infrastructure's in there for that kind of stuff to happen. But really, we don't do that to the society, we do it with and for the society.
And reflect it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Erica?
Yeah, I think also, don't make it feel like homework on a Saturday. You know, this stuff is actually quite cool and quite exciting. And if we can get people to realise that doing things that will improve their resilience doesn't have to be hard and doesn't have to be difficult or necessarily expensive even, you know. So it's about coming up with strategies that people want to buy. You know, resilience should be a choice purchase, not a grudge purchase. So I think we need to market it a little bit more, you know, reduce the friction for people so that they, you know, that they do get these day-to-day benefits from their resilience choices. And if we haven't got the solutions in place now that will provide resilience and make your day-to-day, then we need to actually come up with different solutions, because I think otherwise we're going to be trying to sell a product that people don't necessarily want to buy.
So just on that point, Erica, where does government come into play in the 13 indicators? Apparently resilience of the government economy is an important factor for an organisation's resilience.
Yeah. So those 13 indicators of resilience, we've benchmarked government departments, local government organisations, NGOs. So the same concepts apply for the resilience of a government department. One of the big challenges government departments have is actually imagining failure, because, you know, how does a government department fail? So one of the challenges that we have is working through what does failure look like for their organisation. But exactly the same things apply. You know, they need to be just as resilient as anyone else, and they can improve, and it's about starting the conversation with them.
So just on that point, question, Mike, has Wellington considered, you know, evacuation of its population, those sort of contingencies?
Yes. Our far preferred option is for people to stay. The issue with Wellington is that, unlike Christchurch, most Wellingtonians don't actually come from Wellington. Most of us call somewhere else home. So our worry is that if everybody goes home, they're not going to come back. They're going to go home and stay home. Whereas Christchurch, most Cantabrians have red and black coursing through their veins, and they kind of belong to the place, you know. So we worry about this deeply. That's why we're focused on making Wellington safe enough to stay. That's why we're focusing on people's homes and making sure that they can go home, and the infrastructure to connect them at home is resilient. So specifically, a home by itself is no good. A home needs to have water coming into it, wastewater going out somehow. It needs to be connected to energy, and it needs to be connected by telecommunications. Because in Wellington, again, about 55% of us work in knowledge-intensive industry, so we cannot function without the internet, basically. So we involve central government. MB in particular is heavily involved in our thinking. Not actually the Ministry of Civil Defence so much, but certainly MB. They're the guys that did the machinations behind the electricity investment in resilience. They control the Commerce Commission, or the regulations that the Commerce Commission executes. So given that we live alongside the public servants, we're ideally placed to influence and have discussions with central government people to talk about the risks of Wellington. So yes, we have considered evacuation. We have evacuation plan. Basically, the evacuation plan is you have to walk. We anticipate that all of our net transport infrastructure will be stymied, and that you'll have to go home by foot or by other means. So what that means is we have to think about putting in place water stations, toilet stations, shelter. Interestingly, one of the key things we're looking at is Airbnb, because if you think about Airbnb on an emergency footing, that's a perfect opportunity to match a need with a resource for a temporary basis.
Because you know where the supply is.
Exactly, but that needs good telecommunications. It won't work without gadgets. So that's the kind of thing we're thinking about, but by far our preferred option is to have our infrastructure in our homes safe enough to stay.
So just on that point, because that was going to be my next question, it strikes me that what's common to every disaster these days is the need for integrity in your mobile communication systems. What's our resilience in that space? Not just mobile. So yes, with mobile, particularly for the emergency response, it's really important that we can connect. And actually, Auckland Council did a survey, I think it might have been last year, asking people what was the most important thing for them from a emergency supplies perspective. And the great majority of people didn't put water, but put their cell phone charger. And again, kind of the older people kind of snorted, but then you think about it, it's not just a phone anymore, it's how you connect. It's how we live our lives now. It's not just a phone, so that actually made sense. Fortunately, if you think about it, you can actually plug it into your car, all sorts of things these days. But I think we're really keen to make sure that telecommunications infrastructure is good, not just for the emergency response, but for the recovery. So what often happens with these conversations, we focus on the sexy bit, which is when the sniffer dogs come in, when there's a good goodwill and everybody's kind of caring for each other. But that actually doesn't last, that phase. The next one, when the hard slog and the mental health issues kind of kick in, that's the bit that we're trying to focus on with respect to our resilience strategy. So we don't want to forget that. So from a telecommunications perspective for that, what we're worried about is fibre optic cables and making sure our economy can get back up and running after we've survived so that we can thrive. So those are the sorts of things we're thinking about. We're trying not to focus on the emergency response, but on how we're going to thrive after we've survived. Because we know we're Kiwis, we're really good, excuse my language, but we're really good at getting ourselves out of the shit. That's what we did at Gallipoli. Our whole culture is based on it. And we love nothing more than a tight rugby match where we get out of a tight spot. We're really good at that. But actually we need to think about what happens after that and how we thrive after we've survived.
And so we've been doing some of the economic modelling of Wellington after the earthquake and really looking at when the economy is pushed into that, it's not just whether people can remain within the region. I mean, that's the initial push of people out of the... But then in this recovery phase, it's do people want to remain in the region? So if schooling's disrupted, if your kids can't, learn to swim, if, it's all of those things that make life viable and happy and enjoyable within a region. If people will soon tip out of the region if they don't think it's going to be particularly livable within the next year or so.
Mike, your point about cross-generational views on resilience, I interviewed some 9-year-olds recently and I was struck by a question I asked them was what was their definition of happiness, and one response from a little girl who said a 100% fully charged phone. Which I thought was kind of interesting, isn't it? But that's how Gen Z these days sees pure happiness. There was another question here that I think is a good one, and this has kind of been touched on, I guess, in multiple speakers, Liz, today. Are we underpricing climate risk? If so, what implication does this have for medium-term market stability?
I get the feeling yes. The answer would be yes to that. I know it's called a slow onset disaster, and I very much hope that we're going to have a serious conversation in New Zealand as well as elsewhere on pricing signals. What kind of transition do we need before we have to make, to try and wean people off, certain assumptions around. Was it somebody else said the big house on the coast? But there are some very perverse outcomes, I think. Basically, if you want to pay, you can get insurance for most things. So you'd have to ask the insurance industry, at what point do you think you should be leading a discussion around whether or not that is the right way to proceed. It's because it's completely not sustainable, and there's a point at which, coming back to your earlier conversation, that being very proactive and forward-looking with a prevention focus on risk, on risk is good for business. So there's I didn't touch on this much, but there's a real accountability issue if you're looking at disaster risk reduction, to try and identify, who's really wearing the risk, who's left with the cost, when we transfer the cost elsewhere, what is the situation of those who are having to live with the sort of circumstances that Erica was talking about. I actually think there's a whole conversation that hasn't happened, and part of that is the pricing. I mean, if you price bang just like that, suddenly there's going to be a whole lot of people who can't get mortgages because you have to have insurance, So there's a transition there, but really it does seem a little bizarre at the moment.
So just a follow-up question to that one, and you can all feel free to comment. Do you think insurance is a positive or negative influence in New Zealand in the way that it sends price signals on disaster risks and making development possible in areas that would otherwise be too exposed?
I think it's both, but I think we have a cultural issue in New Zealand and Australia with the great penetration that the industry has. And I think Christchurch proves this, kind of out of sight, out of mind. It's insured, so we don't need to worry about it. And I think that probably does us a disservice in terms of investing in resilience. And the example I would use would be low damage design for buildings in Wellington, where a whole bunch of building owners, all our building owners just shift the risk onto the insurer. But actually that's after the fact, and doesn't actually, as we now know, doesn't actually mean that you can reoccupy and keep your economy going. So we're really keen to have a discussion about that. The other area is Elizabeth's just saying, is around sea level rise. We're watching what's happened with flood re in the UK very closely with respect to what might happen in New Zealand. I understand that we kind of, in terms of scale, we're not, we're a bit player, but we're really keen to understand what's happened there and how that might translate into New Zealand, because in terms of planning a city, access to insurance is a key aspect we have to take into account when we're planning the future of Wellington. So that's why we're really pleased to have Tim on our steering group and kind of providing advice on this kind of stuff at a strategic level.
Does anyone else want to add to that?
I think you have to look quite long term, and I think sustainability is actually a good word in that respect, because how sustainable is it to keep picking up the cost through insurance pools for activities that really just don't make any long-term sense? And at what point does the reinsurance market start to say, you know what, this is all too hard, I think I'll take my investment somewhere else? So I think in terms of, and it's not just in the reinsurance market, in terms of attracting inwards investment, I mean, one of the issues that we were pushing really hard in UNISDR is to try and get the disaster risk as a key consideration in those boardroom decisions and on balance sheets, and is this an attractive place to invest long term? And there's a point at which it will not be if we do not transition into a much more sustainable, an outlook that really tries to build and plan with sustainability and I'll say prevention again, risk reduction in mind, rather than just assuming we're going to just sweep up the mess, disaster by disaster. We're too small an economy. We won't be able to afford that long term.
All right, we're just about out of time, but I've got the perfect question to finish on for you, Mike. Will the hurricane stay in Wellington after the big one?
There's no shifting the hurricane. That sounds like from a Cantabrian. Thank you, Bevan.
And of course, the hurricanes, of course, could play an important advocacy, I guess, an ambassadorial role. We talked about that, didn't we? You did in your own presentation about how you bring influencers, people who can influence this discussion into the process. I suppose that might be one part of the consideration package, perhaps.
Yeah, and we've done that before. When Jerry Collins was alive, we used him as he used to work as one of our rubbish collectors, and we used Jerry as a litter officer. So he stood menacingly on a corner where people used to litter, and after that, nobody dropped litter on that corner anymore. It's up to Riggy, I think, in Wellington.
Amazing the impact. All right, can I ask you please to thank our panel, Elizabeth Longworth, Erica Seville, and Mike Mendonca. Thanks very